All right, we're back on track. That was fascinating, a look at the Homeland. We're going to widen out to the global picture with the evolving threat landscape. Christy Abizaid, former director of the National Counterterrorism Center, and Nick Rasmussen, who is the Counterterrorism coordinator for the Department of Homeland Security. And they're stuck with me as their moderator, so this will be fun. Let's bring out our two speakers for a fireside chat. I hope you're just as comfortable. All right, is this on? It's one of these. Hello. All right. Christy looked at the microphone and says, "This feels like Congress," so she can be at her most comfortable. You know, when we did the FBI version of CompStat, we used to go to the field offices and say to the SAC and their assembled leadership, "What are your top 3 threats?" Nick, you look at this every day. From the global threat stream standpoint, what are the top 3 threats?
Well, we're just on the cusp at DHS of putting out our annual Homeland Threat Assessment, which comes out in September of each year, that my colleague and friend Ken Weinstein, our Undersecretary for Intelligence, will put out. The nice thing about that from a counterterrorism community perspective is it's unclassified. It's not some document that's hidden from public view. It's going to talk openly and plainly about the counterterrorism or the terrorism threat picture, as well as a host of other homeland security threats that we face. And it's going to lift up and point to, I think, something that's been talked about in this setting over the last day and a half, the rising prominence of the DVE, the domestic violent extremist threat, and how that occupies an increasingly prominent place at the center of our threat landscape. And then just when you get your brain kind of wrapped around that piece of the problem, and the last panel did a terrific job of unpacking the drivers of that challenge, just when you get your head wrapped around that piece of it, you live through kind of what we lived through during Christie's waning days this summer, and it was a refresher course for all of us that the Islamic State still very much has an intent to engage with individuals here in the homeland, to try to direct them at some point to engage with at-risk or radicalized individuals here in the homeland for the purpose of potentially orienting them towards some kind of attack activity. We can talk a little bit about the kind of disruptive activity that led to that this summer. But it was, I think, an oh dear, or worse, moment for the counterterrorism community this summer, because it was a refresher, as I said, that the threat landscape doesn't allow us to cross things off with an X and move on from them very easily. Even as the domestic violent extremism landscape gets challenging, worse, harder, more complex, all of those things, we've still got this latent challenge and problem with our core FTO, terrorist adversaries. And then the last thing I'd say, and some of our partners don't bucket this in the terrorism or counterterrorism space, but we do, and that is the threat posed by state actors, including here in the homeland. It's been well documented with cases in recent days showing that Iranian dissidents are at risk here in the United States of potential assassination activity, and of course we've had also arrest and charging activity from the Department of Justice that reminds us that the Iranian government is still very much intent on retaliating against senior level US government officials that they associate with past actions against Iran. So 3 big buckets there, all of which I wouldn't lift any one of them above any of the others, because as this crowd knows, when you operate in a zero tolerance for failure mode, you don't have the luxury of saying, I care less about this and more about this. I'll stop there.
We could do the entire rest of this panel just on those 3 threats alone, but let's turn to one of them. As Nick mentioned, as you were finishing up at the NCTC, this Tajik case was literally occupying the senior most levels of the counterterrorism community, right into the White House briefings about who are these people, how did they get here, what are their intentions, and what do we do with it? Is it an intelligence collection platform where we follow it, watch it, listen to it, or do we disrupt it early because we don't know where it's going? What were you what were the tensions there?
Well, I mean, to Nick's point, the counterterrorism community has to be engaged on all fronts at the same time, in ways that, in the immediate post 9/11 era, or even in the ISIS era, where we could focus the balance of our time on a piece of the threat. In this post October 7th environment, we have all different aspects of the threat sort of elevating at the same time that requires coverage across the counterterrorism community all at the same time. And that we have an ISIS threat tied one to individuals in the homeland that are linked overseas for the first time, in really nearly a decade, challenged us to both retain the coverage on all the other threats at the same time, deal with concerns about Iranian assassination attempts, deal with individual homegrown violent extremists, domestic violent extremists, and then make smart decisions about the way that we're going to approach learning as much as we can from an intelligence collection standpoint about what's going on with these individuals, and figuring out what the global pressure strategy looks like to really cut ISIS back down to that sort of low-level insurgent organization that has less and less reach into the United States. And, ISIS at this time is not only benefiting from the post-October 7th environment, but it's benefiting from sort of discrete safe havens from which it can operate. I think renewed focus on virtual outreach, a sophisticated sort of propaganda arm that is not only reaching out to individuals all over the world in English language or Arabic, but also Tajik, Urdu, and that it's finding its footing at the same time that the susceptibility of individuals to their messaging is higher than ever in this post-October 7th environment. What we dealt with in that threat was sort of multiple...
Do we need to do the 30-second summary of what that case was for people who don't know it?
Yeah, so we had several individuals here in the United States, Tajiks who had crossed the southwest border over the last year or so. Nick can confirm the details here. That we discovered after they had arrived had ties to ISIS individuals overseas. We were quite concerned about what their activity and their connectivity meant. And so we spent a fair amount of time, resource, connectivity across the interagency to determine what that actually meant. And it was the first time, I think in years, that we saw such a firm linkage between individuals here and plotters overseas. And that raised a significant degree of concern about what it meant for what they were planning, especially in the wake of an attack in Moscow at a theater that caused significant casualties, in an area of the world where their security services are actually, fairly strong. So that ISIS is regaining its footing. It has been successful in Moscow. It's been successful in Iran. It has rebuilt parts of its network, and there are individuals more susceptible than ever to its messaging. Just meant that we really had to be on our A game as an interagency team to make sure that we could disrupt it. And actually, I would count our work on that threat stream across FBI, DHS, NCTC, the typical intelligence agencies that need to be involved as really one of the most effective counterterrorism coordination efforts that I've seen in my tenure, certainly, but also in my career.
And what's interesting about it is, based on the regular model, this would be an FBI case, right? We're in a disruption, we're in a prevention, but you might pull that thread for many, many months or a year, surveillance and so on and so forth, and try to get to a material support case. But at the end, it was about managing risk. There's a lot of people involved in this, and there's a lot of communications we can see and potentially a lot of communications we can't see. How did DHS rise to this challenge among the group of decision makers there to say, we can use our unique authorities and abilities to be the disruption?
It's a great question, John, and let me kind of double down on what Christy said. I think the level of integration, coordination, and synchronization that was going on a near daily basis over a period of 3, 4, 5 months was just something I hadn't seen in a while in our CT enterprise. And it was reassuring to me to see that we were, in fact, still very much capable of operating in that way.
It was so 2004, 2005.
But you point to something really unique about this case, and that is we did have, again, because of the unique circumstances surrounding these subjects of interest, having crossed the southwest border as they did, we had DHS authorities and tools to bring to bear to play a disruption, or to help create a disruptive effect that we might not have had if those individuals had been U.S. citizens or green card holders or held some other status. And so DHS's approach during this period was that we were always, at every point, acting in service of an FBI-led investigation. And we wanted our FBI partners, and indeed the rest of our interagency CT community partners, to know that those tools were at the disposal of the enterprise, but it would be, in a sense, driven by the Bureau's decision-making since they had the lead in the investigation. And the result has been that we were able to achieve disruptive effect, not, as you suggest, John, in the kind of classical way with an Article III charging process that would bring people to, in front of the court in the Southern District of New York or something like that. But what we did was mitigate and manage risk, remove the threat, address the threat in a way consistent with our laws and values, and taking full advantage of the toolkit that we had. And I think it's led us to think, okay, how do we think more expansively about that toolkit, because this probably won't be the last time we're confronted with a case of this sort. And so I think it's helped us get better. And I know this group's going to be hearing from our White House colleague, Dr. Sherwood Randall, in a bit. The White House has been really, really helpful in helping us drive a process to make ourselves sharpen our skills at thinking about how we use this wider toolkit to manage particularly that set of challenges that come from individuals who may have entered the country irregularly. Because again, that's a phenomenon we had not been seeing in previous eras of our CT post 9/11 life.
So, if I take off my FBI hat and I take off my NYPD hat and I put on my ISIS hat.
You have one of those?
I do. Because if you don't go to bed every night thinking like a terrorist, you don't wake up thinking like a counter-terrorist. It's fantastic for your dream sequences, but but I have a psychiatrist and a psychologist. We're drifting here. Okay, so putting on my ISIS hat.
It's killing time, though, and that's always, as a government official, a good outcome.
Well, that's okay, because where this question turns, neither one of you will want to go. Putting on my ISIS hat, as you just suggested, I need 9 more guys. And, I'm going to target my new cell, because this wasn't a one-off for me. I'm a determined adversary. So that means they exploited the southern border. Now, the southern border is a political third rail. It's controversial. It started off as a canard. Thousands of terrorists streaming over the border as candidates accused people of, all kinds of things. But then, as we saw from the post-Gaza era and testimony from Chris Wray, the FBI director, this plot and others really kind of brought the focus to there are gaps in our national security. The southern border is rising in concern as one of them. So let's get to the reality of the southern border from either the NCTC assessment, and since you're no longer with the NCTC, in this answer, you do have a license to kill, but we like Nick, so you probably won't use it. And then from Nick's standpoint, how do cases like this reshape the thinking on what do you do with that threat on the southern border?
So my takeaway from the experience of the last several months is that the kind of overall strategy we've employed as a government in dealing with our counterterrorism challenges is the right one. And a big pillar of that strategy is continuing to invest in capability to do the kind of day in, day out screening and vetting that we must do at the border to deal with the migration surge. The migration surge of the past few years, I think it's no secret, is a more global phenomenon and less of a hemispheric phenomenon. If we'd been having this conversation 5-6 years ago and talking about a migration surge, we would have been focused on populations from the hemisphere, which would have posed challenges, but not the same sort of national security or counterterrorism challenges that we face with the migration, the diversity of the migrant population that we're experiencing now. So I think what this recent experience has done is kind of underscored the importance of us collectively as a community continuing to invest in the core capabilities and competencies that have always been a piece of our post 9/11 toolkit. And at the front of that, and this is an NCTC prime responsibility, is leading our screening and vetting apparatus that allows us to bring the most and best information that the U.S. government has at its disposal to the frontline operators so that good decisions can be made when individuals are encountered at the southwest border or anywhere that they're entering the United States. Investment in new capability or expanding capability at a time when the resource pull is away from counterterrorism, or at least you're trying to hold the line on resource in the counterterrorism world. It's not a popular position to take into a lot of interagency conversations, but I think this has underscored exactly why we need to continue to invest in that capability. And I think this has helped us accelerate some of the ongoing work to support a national vetting center that would allow us to do far more real-time screening and vetting to mitigate against all kinds of risk at the southwest border. That's a wonky answer, but this is a case where I think the wonkiness is real. And
it's also the case itself is an argument to critics that the system actually works.
Exactly. I mean, you know, yes, it's a political canard to use the border as like the locus of all threats, that terrorists are flooding across the border. But we have long recognized, ever since 9/11, even before that, that the border does present a vulnerability. And the work of counterterrorism is to shore up your defenses against as many vulnerabilities as possible. And so whether it's the southwest border or our ports of entry or the really good work that TSA does in our airports, it's part of an integrated system that has to protect against our worst fears. And, you know, the border security effort, the screening and vetting effort that Nick talks about that is so important to the defense of the country is one part of an integrated defense that starts with overseas intelligence collection, overseas diplomatic and military operations.
And this case encompassed all of those.
Absolutely. And that relies on, once you're in the interior, the kind of law enforcement-led federal, you know, FBI, but also state, local, tribal, and territorial coordination that has to be on the lookout and armed against whatever the potential threat may be.
So to follow up on Nick's observation, which was also Mike Morrell and Graham Allison's observation in their all lights blinking red warning piece in Foreign Affairs, there has been a draw on resources, on the best analysts, on some of the talented people, because they need their best and brightest focused on problem sets like China, like Russia, like Iran on the state actor side, which crosses right back over into terrorism. But I think nowhere has that drain been felt as dramatically as NCTC, because so many of your people are detailees.
Yeah.
The mothership has been calling them back because they suffer the same resource pull as everybody else. What does that mean for Brett and the person after Brett and the future of the NCTC, which is counted on for things just like this?
So the argument that we made over my tenure and that I know is still front of mind is, you know, if resources are going to be pulled for other national security challenges, as they should be, right? If you're going to find a balance, you also need to stabilize your focus on counterterrorism in a clear place. NCTC was created to be that stable center so that when you have, you know, direction and resource pull, you can count on that to still be a center of excellence for the counterterrorism fight. Counterterrorism is not going away. The terrorist threat is persistent, as you have been talking about here in this conference over the last, you know, day and a half. And so how we both sort of create space for others to do other things, but invest in the right level of capability to be sustained, the sustainable counterterrorism platform for the United States government, I think NCTC is at the center of it, but so is the role that Nick now plays at DHS, so is a very strong bureau representation out of CTD and in the field offices. The JTTFs are still important. And coordinating all of that so it works together in the face of a real threat, like we were dealing with the Tajik concerns, that is what's essential. So we have to sustain it. We have to maintain the capability, and we have to require that NCTC and others charged with CT are flagging for decision makers when it is absolutely necessary to engage forcefully in the counterterrorism fight.
The only thing I'd add to what Christy just said is that we're not uniquely challenged with this set of circumstances. When we engage with our foreign partners, and that happens most intensively with our Five Eyes partners in the UK, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, they're all having a similar conversation. They may have started at a different scale than we are in terms of their counterterrorism enterprise or their counterterrorism apparatus, but they face the same pressures and challenges. They too are confronted by foreign malign influence, hostile state actor activity in their homelands. And so I think that from our perspective, it even more than ever puts a premium on sustaining those partnerships so that we burden share more effectively and take advantage of each of our partners' comparative advantage, because some have stuff that we don't do as well, and we certainly have stuff that we do uniquely well. And so the kinds of relationships that are forged not just within the U.S. government counterterrorism community, but externally with our partners become even more important than ever in a resource-constrained environment.
Well, I couldn't think of two people, both serving leaders, who know this global threat picture better than the two people sitting here. Thank you for sharing. Thank you for your candor and your perspective. And before we thank our panel, we're on our way into a 15-minute break. We want to thank BTIG Global Financial for sponsoring that coffee break and everything that comes with it. And now, please thank our two guests.